If stories about the men who let the work speak for itself are the kind of thing you want more of, there will be more of them, and they will be here. He had the metric he was proud of, and it was this. On the unit's standard hostage rescue drill, a stack of 4, a 2-room clearance, 4 threats and 2 non-threats, from breach to last shot, he had, on the day he took command of his squadron, run it in 11 seconds. That was the fastest time in the squadron that year. He knew, because he had asked, that it was inside the fastest quartile in the unit's history. He was not arrogant. He was worse than arrogant, in the way that mattered for this story. He was quietly certain he had operated with SEAL Team 6 on a joint tasking in the Horn, with GIGN on a counter-terrorism exchange in Toulon, and with Polish GROM on a training rotation in the Baltic, and he had, in his private assessment, come away from each with the sense that the Americans did some things a little better and other things a little worse, and that on the whole no one on earth was doing hostage rescue at the speed and the standard of his own. It is worth knowing who Elliot Vance was before he arrived at Credenhill. He had come up the American way, which is to say the long way. West Point in the late 1990s, infantry branch, the Ranger tab earned at Fort Benning when Benning was still called Benning without apology. Then Ranger Battalion for the first 2 tours before he tried for and passed the selection course that the American Army will still not officially discuss by its full name. He had 3 combat tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and a stretch in a country he would only ever refer to as east of there. He had, by his own count, been through more than 400 rooms with a rifle up and men behind him, and he had lost in that time 7 of those men, each of whom he could name, and each of whose funerals he had attended in the same dark suit. He was, in the accurate and unsentimental language of his own community, a good operator and a very good commander. He was fit, not the fitness of a marathoner, but the wiry, load-bearing fitness of a man who had carried plates and ammunition and a wounded corporal down a Hindu Kush ridgeline in the same afternoon. He shot to the unit's standard, which is a standard most professional soldiers never see, let alone meet. He kept, in the left breast pocket of whatever jacket he was wearing, a small green notebook, and he wrote in it in pencil because pens froze at altitude, a habit from a Kandahar winter in his second tour. There is a stopwatch in his hand, and it is running. Elliot Vance stands on the wing of a Royal Navy frigate at 3 in the morning, off a coast the briefing room called only the operating area, and he is watching a shape in the water that he cannot see. The tanker is a wall of black steel, 400 meters to port, lit only where it needs to be lit, riding low with a cargo the manifest calls crude and the men who took her call leverage. Somewhere below her waterline, or against her hull, or already on her deck, are men Vance was flown 3,000 miles to observe. He has been given the stopwatch as a courtesy. The British officer beside him, a lieutenant colonel whose name he already respects and whose face he can barely make out, said, before they came up to the bridge wing, "Start it when the assault call goes. Stop it when we call the ship secure. And write the number down for your people, because they are not going to believe you when you tell them. The call has already gone." Vance is a colonel. He commanded a Delta squadron for 2 years and change. He has kicked doors in Mosul and Sangin and places he still cannot say aloud, and he has, in a professional life spent measuring men by the second, never in his career seen anyone take a moving vessel of this size in under 20 minutes. That is the number he came with. 20 was the fast time. 15 was the mythology. 9 was the figure the British had put in a briefing slide back at Credenhill, and Vance, who is polite, had not laughed, and had, in private with Rear Admiral Corriveau afterwards, said the number was theatre. The second hand on the stopwatch is at 40 seconds and moving. There is no gunfire he can hear. There is no shouting on the radio. There is a click, and then another click, and then a voice he will later learn belongs to a warrant officer from Carmarthenshire, says, very quietly, "Deck secure," moving on the block. And Vance looks down at the watch face in the wet dark and understands that the question he flew here to answer is not whether the British are good, it is what he is going to say when this stops. to understand what the number on that stopwatch meant, and why the man holding it went home chained without being unpleasant about it, that they were very good, and that they were probably not, at the sharp edge of things, as fast as the unit. That was the belief he was carrying when the phone in his office rang, and Rear Admiral Wade Corriveau, who chewed unlit cigars and had commanded 3 SEAL teams and did not waste a syllable in his life, told him he was going to Hereford. The tasking, when Corriveau explained it, was simple and unusual. The two governments were in one of those quiet cycles of assessment they run every few years. Not a formal exercise, not a treaty obligation, just a working-level look at each other's capability in an area where both nations invested heavily and neither talked about publicly. The Americans wanted, specifically, to observe how 22 SAS handled maritime counterterrorism, opposed boardings, gas and oil platform assaults, and hostage rescue on a moving vessel at sea. B Squadron carried the maritime tasking that year, the squadron whose lineage ran through boat troop and the amphibious side of the regiment's work, and the British had agreed, with a courtesy that Vance would later recognize as its own kind of confidence, to host a small American delegation for 2 weeks that would end with a live opposed boarding exercise on a real merchant tanker off the Welsh coast. The delegation was 3 men and 1 woman. Corriveau would come himself, wearing the 2 stars and the chewed cigar, and saying almost nothing. Master Chief Petty Officer Brendan Kalani would come from Naval Special Warfare, because if you were going to watch maritime work, you brought a man who had run Bud/S as an instructor and had never lost a bet on a stopwatch. Captain Nadia Ferreira would come from the intelligence side of Joint Special Operations Command, because she spoke 4 languages, and briefed from memory because paper left a trail. And Vance would run the delegation, because Corriveau had told him, in the corridor outside the office with the door still open, "I need someone who is going to write down what he sees, and not what he expected to see, and I think you are honest enough to do that." Vance flew into Brize Norton on a Tuesday. A driver in the plane Discovery took the 4 of them west, and the country softened into hedgerows he had not seen since a rotation to Wiltshire in his early career. And after 90 minutes the driver turned in through a gate that from the road looked like nothing much at all. Creedon Hill, near Hereford, in the west of England, not, as the American briefing pack had inaccurately said, in Wales. Vance corrected the map in his own head. The selection ground, he had been told, was the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains, over the border. The base was here, on the English side, and it looked, from the inside of the car, like a well-kept army camp with unremarkable buildings and remarkable men in them. They were met by a warrant officer with a soft accent and no ceremony, shown to accommodation, and given a schedule that evening in the mess, over a plate of something Kalani ate with visible suspicion. A British major dropped into the seat opposite Vance and said, casually, that the culmination on day 13 would be a live boarding on a Suezmax tanker chartered for the exercise, that the regiment's published planning time on a target like that was between 9 and 11 minutes from assault call to ship secure, and that the Americans were welcome to bring stopwatches. Vance smiled politely. Later, in the room Kalani was sharing with Ferreira's radio kit, with the door shut and the delegation halfway down a bottle of Kalani's own single malt, Vance said the sentence that he would, in the years afterwards, remember as the sentence he had to eat. 9 minutes on a live tanker. I'll believe it when I stop the watch myself. Kalani had laughed. Ferreira had not. Corriveau, who did not drink and who was reading the schedule with a pencil in his hand, had said only, without looking up, "Good. Stop the watch yourself." That was Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Vance had his boots on and his notebook out, and a corporal named Braithwaite was waiting for him at the door, with a hillside on the schedule and an expression that said, mildly, that the American colonel was going to have a long day. The first morning in Creedon was, on paper, an introduction, a tour of the maritime training facility, a walk through the squadron lines, a set of briefings on the 2 weeks to come. It was, in practice, the first time Vance's expectations began to slide off center, and he could not, at the time, put his finger on why. It began with the walk from the accommodation to the squadron building. There were men on the paths, some in kit and some not, and none of them looked at the American delegation with any particular interest. Vance had been on enough foreign bases to know what a visiting delegation usually generates. The sideways looks, the quiet performance of professionalism for the observers, the officer who materializes to escort you around obstacles. Here, there was none of that. A staff sergeant walked past them with a Bergen on one shoulder and a mug of tea in his free hand, and nodded at Corriveau the way you nod at a neighbor taking the bins out. It was not disrespect. It was, Vance realized slowly, the absence of ceremony. The warrant officer who met them was Iwan Riddach. He was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders in the compact way of a man who had done a lot of climbing, and he spoke with a soft Carmarthenshire lilt that Vance's American ear registered as Welsh before it registered as anything else. He was the squadron sergeant major of B Squadron, a warrant officer class 2, the senior non-commissioned officer of the Sabre Squadron carrying the maritime tasking, and he ran the introduction with the same economy Vance had noticed on the paths outside. He was, Vance would notice through the fortnight, the only man in the room who did not raise his voice when the plan changed. He did not tell the delegation what the squadron could do. He asked what they wanted to see. When Vance said, honestly, everything you're prepared to show us, Riddach nodded once and said, right, we'll start with the pool this afternoon and take you through it in the order we'd take a new man. Not a new officer, a new man. Vance noted it. They met Dominic Ashcombe in the squadron gym at 11. Ashcombe was a staff sergeant, a boat troop team leader, and he was doing pull-ups when they came in. Not for show, not counting, just working through a set the way a man brushes his teeth. He dropped off the bar, wiped his palms, and shook Vance's hand with a grip that was neither soft nor performative. He did not mention Vance's rank. He asked where Vance had done his last operational tour, listened to the answer, and said, right, that valley. I was in the next one over in 09. Bad ground for helicopters. Then he moved on. Vance had, in his long career, met a great many men who had performed humility as a display. He had never, in a first meeting, been quietly outclassed on shared ground by a man who had then declined to make anything of it. He wrote a single sentence in the notebook in his breast pocket that afternoon. These men do not perform. He looked at it for a moment and added, underneath, which is itself the performance, or it isn't. That evening at dinner in the mess, Corriveau, who had said perhaps 12 words all day, leaned across the table and said quietly, what have you got? Vance thought about it before he answered. He said, they're not selling. Every unit I've ever visited was selling, one way or another. These men are not selling. Corriveau considered that, and then said, what do you think that means? And Vance honestly said, I don't know yet. It might mean they're better than they look. It might mean they're worse and don't know it. I'll tell you on Friday. Corriveau nodded and went back to his food. What Vance did not yet know, and what the whole 2 weeks was about to teach him, was that the economy he was reading as absence, the missing shouting, the missing swagger, the missing display, was the visible edge of a philosophy the regiment had settled on decades earlier and refined in blood. Speed was not the goal. Speed was the byproduct. What the regiment sold, when it sold anything, was economy of effort applied to hard problems, and the number on a stopwatch was what fell out of the far end of the process, not what drove it. He would understand that by the second week. For now he had a hillside on the schedule. The hillside on the schedule was in Wales, 40 miles west of Credenhill, in the northern edge of the Brecon Beacons, where the ground rises hard out of the valleys, and Pen y Fan sits above it all. The ground they used was the same kind of ground, bracken and peat, running water where you did not expect running water, weather that arrived without a forecast. The Tab was not billed as a test. It was billed by Riddach as a walk to loosen the delegation off before the waterwork. Vance, who had done selection courses on 3 continents, understood the phrasing for what it was. He put his boots on carefully that morning. The load was a Bergen packed to 25 kilos. The route was 14 miles across broken ground, with 2 rendezvous points and a compressed timescale that Ridderch mentioned once, in passing, and did not repeat. The party was 6 men from the regiment and the 4 Americans, and the pace, from the moment they left the vehicles, was the pace of men who did this for a living. Vance held the pace. He was proud of that afterwards, in the honest way a professional is proud of not failing. He held the pace, and he kept his footing on ground that took Killarney down twice. And he arrived at the second rendezvous inside the compressed timescale, with his lungs burning and his legs empty, and a private satisfaction that he had not embarrassed himself. What he could not do was what the SAS men were doing. He noticed it first at the first rendezvous 40 minutes in. Ashcombe, who had been walking behind the point man, dropped his Bergen, drank half a bottle of water in one pull, and in the 4 minutes the party stopped, pulled out a laminated map, oriented it, walked the next leg with his finger, and briefed the 2 men beside him on 3 separate contingencies, one of which involved a stream crossing that Vance had not registered on the ground and had not noticed on his own map. The brief lasted 90 seconds. It contained more information, more accurately delivered, than the operational orders Vance had sat through as a captain. Ashcombe was not out of breath. Vance was. At the second rendezvous, 12 miles in, Ridderch, who had walked the whole route without ever appearing to work at it, said mildly that the plan had changed and they were going to divert north for another 3 miles, because the weather was going to close in and the ground they had planned to cross would be a river inside the hour. He said it the way a man reads out a train time. He did not raise his voice. Corriveau, who had walked the whole tab with 2 stars on his shoulder and a heart rate Vance suspected was under 90, looked at Ridderch for a long moment, and then across at Vance, and said very quietly, "Are you writing this down?" Vance was not writing it down. Vance was leaning on a rock, and the notebook was still in his pocket, and he understood, with a clarity that was not welcome, that the tab was not the test. The tab was the environment inside which the test was happening. The test was, can you plan, brief, and adapt, while carrying 25 kilos over bad ground in bad weather, and can you do it in the 4 minutes you have? The regiment could. He could carry the weight. He could not, on that ground and at that pace, have run the brief. He took the notebook out. They came off the hill at 1500 hours and were in vehicles by 1600 and at the maritime training facility on the south coast by 2200. Because the schedule Ridderch had written did not build in decompression the way American schedules built in decompression, the delegation ate in the vehicles. They arrived at a low grey building on the water and were met by a chief instructor who did not tell them his name and who ran, for the next 4 hours, an evolution Vance had understood on paper and had never seen executed cold. Vance watched it from the bridge of the exercise vessel with a set of night vision goggles and a growing understanding of the gap between what he could do and what he was seeing. What broke the first assumption was not the speed, though the speed was remarkable. It was that when the pair came over the rail, Sergeant Marcus Odenyo first, a broad Londoner who had grown up in Peckham and joined the Paris at 17, and still, Vance would learn, called his mother from every port, with water sluicing off him, and a Diemaco L11, 9A2 carbine already up and clearing his arcs. Neither of them was breathing hard. They had swum 300 meters, climbed 15, and arrived at the top of a merchant ship's rail with the resting heart rate of men. Those men are not tired. They were not. Vance, back in the vehicle at 0300 with the notebook open on his knee, wrote a single sentence that would, in time, become the sentence he taught to the American captains he mentored in the years afterwards. The physical work is the price of admission. It is not the currency they trade in. He looked at what he had written, and he understood that his first assumption that the difference between his unit and this one would be measurable in weight, speed, and equipment was not correct. The difference was in what the weight and the speed and the equipment were being spent on, and he had a shooting package in the morning. There is a point on any hard learning curve, when the professional ego does the necessary work of defending itself. Vance's did it that Wednesday night in the small room the regiment had given him at the maritime facility, with the sea audible through the window, and the notebook open on the desk, and the light on because sleep was not coming. He had, he told himself, been physically tested and had passed. He had been outperformed on the fieldcraft, and he was willing to write that down, but fieldcraft was not the arena in which his unit was measured. His unit was measured on the room, on the shot, on the 4-man stack and the 11-second drill. 9 minutes on a tanker was still, in his private assessment, a number that would prove itself impossible when the tanker was moving and the men on it were competent. He would see the shooting in the morning. He would see the killing house on Friday. He knew what world-class hostage rescue looked like. He would know it when he saw it, and he would know its absence. He wrote a single line in the notebook: "Reserve judgment until the room." He closed the notebook and then, because he was honest, opened it again and added underneath, "And until you can hold their pace with an aching Bergen and a live brief." The next morning he ran into Ashcombe in the corridor outside the cookhouse, and Ashcombe was standing at the window with a mug in his hand, looking at the grey water, and Vance, because the corridor was empty and because he had been thinking about it, said, "How long did it take you to be able to do that brief at the first rendezvous?" Ashcombe considered the question. He was wearing a plain olive T-shirt, and Vance could see, on a bootlace round his neck, a wedding ring hanging inside the collar. Ashcombe caught the direction of the look and said, matter-of-factly, "Lost weight on a job in the Gulf. It kept slipping off. My wife told me to keep it where I couldn't lose it." Then he answered the actual question. "About 4 years. Not the brief. The brief is easy. The brief while your legs are gone. 4 years. And you don't get there by practicing the legs until the brief has room to happen." Vance nodded. He did not write it down in front of Ashcombe. He wrote it down 20 minutes later at breakfast. There was a moment, over the porridge, when Kalani leaned across the table and said, half joking, "You noticed their kit, half of what we spent on the men who beat us up a hill yesterday." Corriveau looked up from his coffee. He said, flatly, "That is not the lesson, Master Chief. Do not take that lesson home." By 9 that morning they were on the range, and by 10 they were in the killing house. And by 11 Vance was standing at the observation gallery with his notebook closed in his pocket, and a question forming that he did not yet know how to phrase, which was this: if these men were this good in the water at 4 in the morning, what were they going to look like in the room? He was about to find out. The killing house at Credenhill is, from the outside, an unremarkable building. It is windowless, low, and sat on a piece of the base that most personnel walk past without turning their heads. Inside it is a series of reconfigurable rooms with modular walls, ballistic rubber packed into the material behind the plasterboard, and the accumulated character of 40 years of live-fire close-quarter work. The regiment did not invent the room drill. The regiment did, over decades and after Prince's Gate and after the Iranian embassy, refine it into something that other services still send their people to look at. Vance walked in with Ridderch on his left and Corriveau behind him. The smell inside was propellant and paint and a faint, chalky note of shredded rubber. And it was the same smell that lived in the American shoot-houses Vance had spent his professional life inside, and he registered it and felt, for the first time since arriving, on ground he understood. Ridderch said, "We're going to run the standard drill, and then we're going to ask you to run it, and then we're going to run it a different way." The standard drill was a 4-man stack, 2 rooms, 4 threats, 2 non-threats. Vance recognized it on the layout board. It was, in essential architecture, the drill his own unit used. He noted, without saying anything, that the times were going to be comparable. The regiment ran it first, Ashcombe on point, Odenyo second. 2 men Vance had not been introduced to on 3 and 4. The whole run was over in 8 seconds. 8 seconds was, in absolute terms, a very fast time. It was inside Vance's squadron's fastest quartile. Vance wrote it down. Then Vance was asked to run the drill. He ran it with 3 of his own, Kalani on 3, and 2 of Ashcombe's men, 1 on his hip and 1 on the rear, borrowed for the drill because they knew the layout. He ran it in 9.5. That, too, was very fast. He allowed himself, walking off the range, a small correction to his private ledger. The standard was comparable. His men could do this. He could do this. Ridderch said, "Right, now we're going to run it the way we'd run it on the job." The layout board changed. The rooms stayed the same. The threats and non-threats stayed the same. Ashcombe leads. Odenyo behind him. 2 men on 3 and 4. The sprint eats 45 seconds because the ground outside the house is broken. The breach charge is placed in 8 seconds by a Corporal Vance does not know, and the charge fires and the door is not there anymore, and the stack goes through the gun smoke. The room is dark, and then it flickers, and then it is dark again. Vance is watching on the observation gallery through a set of thermal displays. The 4 men move as a single shape. Ashcombe's carbine comes up on the first threat inside the first meter, and there are 2 shots that are, in the recording afterwards, 140 milliseconds apart. Odenyo takes the second threat on Ashcombe's off-shoulder without a word being spoken. The stack flows through the doorway between the rooms. The third and fourth threats are down. The 2 non-threats, a mannequin dressed as a hostage seated in a chair and a mannequin dressed as a child on the floor, are untouched. The whole entry from the breech firing to the last shot is under 6 seconds. The whole run from the sprint start to room clear is 19 seconds. Vance stands in the gallery with his hand on the rail, and he does not immediately write anything down. They ran the drill again and again, 6 times in total. The variation was in the layout, in the number of threats, in whether one of the mannequins was moving on a wire, in whether the lights failed halfway through. The times moved between 18 and 22 seconds. In one of the runs, Odenyo took a threat Vance had not seen at all, a small figure behind an interior door that opened on a hinge only when the 3rd man crossed the threshold, and Odenyo shot it and did not break stride, and Vance, watching the thermal, understood that Odenyo had shot it because Odenyo had seen the shape of the doorway change and had known what that meant. Vance's men could shoot this standard. Vance's men could not, he was privately certain, shoot this standard after this sprint, with this breach, with this layout change, and the piece that mattered without one word spoken between the 4 assaulters from the moment the sprint began. They came off the range at 1400. Ashcombe drank a bottle of water and said to Vance, in passing, "The shooting isn't the hard bit. The hard bit is being able to shoot after the day you've already had." Vance said, "Honestly, that is the 2nd time in 2 days that a member of your regiment has said something to me that I am going to remember for the rest of my career." Ashcombe grinned briefly and moved on. That night, in his room, Vance wrote in the notebook the sentence that he would, 6 months later, use to open the classified brief he gave at Bragg. "These men shoot to our standard. What they do that we do not do is shoot to our standard while doing everything else at the same standard." He looked at the sentence for a long time. Underneath it he wrote, 9 minutes on a tanker no longer looks like theatre. He did not sleep well. The break came on Sunday, which was the 9th day, and it did not come the way Vance had expected. He had expected, insofar as he had let himself think about it, that if he was going to have a bad moment on this trip, it would come in front of the delegation, in the killing house, or on the range, or on the hill, in a way that a professional could absorb because a professional understood the arithmetic of being outperformed by a peer. He had spent his career being outperformed occasionally and outperforming occasionally in return, and he knew how to metabolize both. What broke him on the 9th day was a conversation over tea. He had been walking the perimeter of the maritime facility in the middle of the afternoon because he needed 30 minutes away from the delegation and away from the noise of the regiment's operational tempo. He came round the corner of one of the low buildings, and Ridderch was sitting on a bench with a mug in his hand and a paperback thriller on his knee, and Ridderch looked up and, without ceremony, gestured to the space beside him. Vance sat down. They talked for a while about nothing much, about the weather, about a rugby match Ridderk had listened to on the radio, about a dog Vance had left with his sister in Virginia. Then Ridderk, in the same soft Welsh voice he used for everything, asked Vance a question. He asked, "What were you hoping to see when they sent you?" Vance considered the question. He had a career's worth of stock answers, and he found, sitting on the bench with the grey water in front of him and a mug going cold in his hand, that he did not want to give any of them. He said, "I was hoping to see the seam. Every unit has a seam. Somewhere the fabric is thin. Everyone I've ever worked with has one, and mine has one, and I was hoping to find yours so I could take it home and use it to argue that we're still the standard." Ridderk nodded slowly. He said, "And?" Vance said, "I haven't found it." Ridderk drank from his mug. He said, "You might. There's a seam. There's always a seam. It's just not where the Americans usually look." Vance said, "Where do the Americans usually look?" Ridderk said, "For the fast man and the good shot and the hard march. Those are our floor. Those are not our ceiling. What we are trying to build, and what we sometimes manage to build, is a man who can think clearly on the third day without sleep, with a bad plan and a friend down. That is a different kind of man to build, and it takes a different kind of time, and we don't always get it right either. But that is where we look." He said it without any particular emphasis. He said it the way a farmer would describe a fence. Vance did not write it down. He did not write anything down for the rest of that day or the day after. The notebook stayed in his pocket. Kalani noticed at supper on Sunday night and did not comment. Corriveau noticed and did comment in the corridor outside Vance's room and asked, mildly, "Are you all right, Colonel?" Vance said, "Honestly, I am reconsidering the arithmetic I came with." Corriveau nodded. He said, "Good. That is why I sent you and not somebody else. The tanker's on Wednesday. Be ready to watch it." That night, Vance lay in the dark and did an inventory of the assumptions he had brought with him. The unit was the fastest hostage rescue force in the world. His 11-second drill was inside the top quartile of a top-quartile organization. The physical standard was the price of admission, and he had paid it a long time ago. The room drill was the arena that mattered. He held each assumption in his hand, one after the other, and he did not throw any of them away, because they were not wrong. He set them down beside a new one, which was that the standard he had spent his career defending was a floor and not a ceiling, and that somewhere on this side of the Atlantic there were men building, quietly and without display. Vance is on the bridge wing of the Royal Navy frigate, at 400 meters to port. He has the stopwatch in his hand. Corriveau is behind him. Kalani is on the far side of the bridge wing with a set of goggles. Ferreira is on the radio net inside the frigate's operations room. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Ellingham, the commanding officer of 22 SAS, whom Vance has seen twice and spoken to once, is on the frigate. Ellingham signs off his messages with a single inked initial and has never been photographed in uniform for a newspaper. He is, at this moment, saying nothing, because Ridderk is running the assault, and Ellingham does not talk over his sergeant major. The assault call goes. Vance starts the watch. 2 rigid inflatables are on the tanker's port quarter, running dark, riding on the vessel's own wake. 2 dived pairs are already in the water, and have been for 11 minutes. Ashcombe's pair are inside the accommodation block. The internal passageways of a Suezmax are narrow and painted a pale institutional cream, and the lighting is set to the vessel's night state, which is dim and red-tinged. Vance is watching the internal feed from a body camera on the third man in the stack. He sees the passageway the way Ashcombe sees it. A long line, a bulkhead door at the end, 3 internal doors on the port side, 2 on the starboard. The stack moves. They move the way they moved in the killing house on Friday. They move without a word. Ashcombe leads, O'Donnell behind him, the third man on the rear, and the fourth, the corporal whose name Vance did not catch. is peeling into each door as they pass, and clearing and calling nothing, because if he has cleared it, there is nothing to call. The first internal door, 2 opposition, both called down in 90 milliseconds. The second, empty. The third, 1 opposition, 1 hostage. And the shot goes over the hostage's shoulder and into the opposition's chest at the base of the neck, and the hostage, a role player who has done this before, does not move because she has been briefed not to move, and because the man behind the rifle has told her, with his body, that she does not need to. 4 minutes 10. The bulkhead door at the end of the passageway. This is the officer's mess. This is where the hostages are. Ashcombe places a small linear charge on the hinge side. Odenyo is on the stack's off-shoulder. The other 2 are set. 4 minutes 45. The charge fires. The stack goes through the smoke. Vance is watching the body camera and the thermal on the bridge wing simultaneously. Inside the mess, 3 opposition, 6 hostages. The 3 opposition are down in under 2 seconds. The hostages are on the floor because they have been briefed to be on the floor. Ashcombe is already at the far door, clearing the connecting galley. Odenyo, the broad Londoner on the rail from the first night, is on the hostages, and Vance can hear on the net now the first raised voice of the entire assault, Odenyo, saying to the hostages in a calm, loud voice, "You are safe, you are safe. Stay on the floor, we are moving you in a moment." That is the loudest anyone on the regiment's side has been. 6 minutes 50. The engine spaces are secure. The bridge is secure. The accommodation is clearing room by room in a wave that is moving forward from the mess. Ridderk is on the net, quiet, cataloguing. 7 minutes 30. 8 minutes. 8 minutes 20. The last opposition man is called down on the funnel deck's under stairwell. 8 minutes 51. Ridderch's voice on the net, soft in the same tone he has used all fortnight. Ship secure. Hostages accounted for 6. Opposition 8. No friendly. Repeat, ship secure. Vance stops the watch. The face of the watch reads 8 minutes and 54 seconds. He stands on the bridge wing in the wet dark, and he looks at the watch face for what feels like a long time. And Corriveau behind him says very quietly, "What does it read, Colonel?" Vance says, 8:54. Corriveau says, "Write it down." Vance writes it down. Years later, when Elliot Vance had left the army and taken the second career that men in his line sometimes take, a chair at a defense institute, a name on a masthead, a place at the tables where doctrine is written, he was asked about the fortnight at Hereford in a private symposium at Fort Bragg. The room was closed, and the recording was not made, but he was asked to speak on the record for the historical file, and what he said, by his account and by the accounts of the 2 colleagues who were in the room, is preserved in the following form. He was asked, first, what number was on the stopwatch. He said, 8 minutes and 54 seconds from assault call to ship secure. I stopped the watch myself. I wrote the number down at the time, and I still have the notebook. He was asked what he had reported to Rear Admiral Corriveau on the frigate that night. He said, I told him the number. He asked me what I thought it meant. I said, honestly, that the number was not the interesting thing. The number was the byproduct. The interesting thing was that in 8 minutes and 54 seconds, on a 274-meter hull at 3 in the morning, in weather I would not have chosen, against a role-playing force of 8 men from their own training staff, the assaulting party had spoken on the net a total of 11 times. I had counted. He was asked what Corriveau said back. Vance told the room on the record what Rear Admiral Wade Corriveau said back to him on the bridge wing of a Royal Navy frigate at 02:15 on a wet Wednesday off the Welsh coast, with the tanker still floodlit at 400 metres and the assault party being extracted by RIB. Corriveau had chewed the unlit cigar for a moment and had looked at the tanker and had looked at Vance and had said the thing that was, in Vance's account, the closest thing to a verdict that the United States Joint Special Operations Command ever put on the record about the assault it had just watched. I have been in this business for 31 years. I have run 3 teams, and I have watched more assaults than most men have watched films. That was the cleanest piece of work I have seen in my career. I do not want to know how they teach it. I want to know how they hire the men who can learn it. Write that down, Colonel, exactly as I have said it, and put it in the report. And do not soften it, because if we soften it, we will not learn anything. We are still, as an organization, better at building the fast man than at building the finished man. And the finished man is what they build over there. I do not think we will get there in my lifetime, because getting there would require us to stop measuring ourselves the way we currently measure ourselves. But we are closer than we were, and we are closer because of that fortnight, and because of Rear Admiral Corriveau's sentence, and because of the 8 minutes and 54 seconds on my watch. Somebody in the room asked whether he had ever spoken to the regiment about it afterwards, whether he had gone back. Vance said, "I went back twice. The second time I brought a captain who was about to command a squadron of his own, and I introduced him to a warrant officer with a soft Welsh voice who is now retired. And the warrant officer said the same things to my captain that he had said to me, and my captain came home changed, the same way I had come home changed. That is the closest I have come, in the years since, to paying back what they gave me." He closed the notebook and the meeting ended. That, on the record, is what U.S. Command said. Elliot Vance retired from the United States Army 4 years after the fortnight in Hereford. He wrote in his valedictory address at Bragg that his career had contained 3 or 4 events he considered formative, and that the fortnight with the regiment was the last of them, and the one that had, more than any other, changed the way he thought about the work. He kept the notebook. He kept also a habit that he had picked up from Rydach on a bench in the wet afternoon at the maritime facility, which was to ask of any young officer he mentored what they were hoping to see when they went to look at another force. He would let them answer, then he would ask them, more quietly, what they were hoping to find that would confirm what they already believed, and he would tell them, gently, that the trip they should be prepared for was the trip that took that belief away. Rear Admiral Corriveau retired the following year. His sentence on the bridge wing did make it into the classified after-action report, in the form Vance had written it down, and it did circulate, in the way sentences circulate in that community, and it did shape, in ways that are difficult to measure and easy to feel, the direction of some parts of American Joint Special Operations thinking in the decade that followed. The men of B Squadron, most of whose real names would not be used in a public account of the fortnight for reasons that are obvious, went back to work the following Monday. Rydach retired 2 years later to a small village in Carmarthenshire, where he taught his grandchildren to fish. Ashcombe was promoted to warrant officer and served another 6 years before leaving the army. O'Denyo transferred to the training wing. Braithwaite is understood to still be serving, though nobody who would know is prepared to say. Ellingham handed the commanding officer's chair to his successor and moved to a role at the Ministry of Defence, and the single-inked initial continued to appear on his signatures until he stopped signing things at all. And Vance's stopwatch, the one he held on the bridge wing of a Royal Navy frigate, at 3 a.m. off a coast the briefing had called only the operating area, is in a drawer in a house in Virginia, still keeping time, its second hand still moving in the same steady circle it made on the wet night. The number came in at 8 minutes and 54 seconds, and a 2-star admiral chewed an unlit cigar and told a colonel to write down what he had seen and not to soften it. The men who taught him what economy looked like are most of them older now. Some of them are still working, some of them are on benches in Welsh villages with paperback thrillers on their knees. They did not sell. They never sold. That, in the end, is what U.S. Command said, and what the colonel with the pencil wrote down, and what the second hand on the watch is still, in a drawer in Virginia, quietly measuring. 8 minutes, 54 seconds, and a lifetime of understanding what those minutes actually meant.